Okay, I've changed a little bit the way I am doing the Zoom recording. It's not going to start recording until I hit the record button, and I'm afraid I'm going to forget to hit the record button. So if I don't say, you already know about this, if I don't say I started the recording, then let me know, and you'll get 3 points of extra credit if you're the first person to tell me that I forgot to start the recording. Okay, so I have hit the record button for today, and let's see, I am sharing the PowerPoint screen. We're going to continue today with our review of supply and demand. As we've said before, supply and demand is going to be really, really important to what we do. Go back over a few things we have talked about, and then I'll give you some examples to test your understanding, and then we will go into chapter 5, which is an application of supply and demand. All right, things you want to be sure you understand really well. Demand and quantity demanded, they are not the same thing. Demand refers to the whole demand curve. Quantity demanded refers to a particular quantity that consumers will want to buy at a particular price. A change in the quantity demanded is a movement along a fixed demand curve. A change in demand is a shift of the entire curve. If it is a shift to the right, that's an increase in demand, because if demand is shifting to the right, that means for any given price, say $4 per gallon for the price of gas, if the curve is shifting to the right, that means after the change, the quantity demanded is going to be larger than before. Maybe they wanted 30,000 gallons before. After the change, they want 40,000 gallons. Okay. That's an increase in demand for a product. It's always a rightward shift, also an upward shift of the curve. If you have a given demand curve and the price of the product changes, if the price of gas is $2 and it goes up to $4, okay, does that change the demand for gas? The answer is no. It changes the quantity demanded. Okay. Will consumers notice the change? Absolutely, they will notice. They will be unhappy that the price that they're having to pay more per gallon. They're going to change their quantity demanded. Okay. Instead of wanting, let's say they wanted 40,000 before, now at the higher price, they're going to want some smaller quantity, maybe 30,000. Okay. In the second graph, that's a change in the quantity demanded that results from a change in the price of gas. That's an illustration of the law of demand. Okay? And the same thing holds for supply and quantity supply. If you have a change in the price of gas, the supply of gas will not change. The quantity supplied will change. Okay? Really important to have that clear in your mind, not just that you've memorized it, but you understand it. And then our key idea, equilibrium, that we don't want producers producing more than people want to buy. We don't want them producing less than people want to buy. We want a balance. We want the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied to be equal. Okay? And you've got millions of consumers, thousands of producers. How can we hope that the two are going to be in balance? Because there's nobody in a market economy making the decisions about how much in total to produce. Each consumer is focusing on how much do I want to buy. Each producer is trying to maximize his profit. But we saw that as everybody's focusing on what's good for them, we end up moving to the equilibrium where we have some equilibrium price resulting, and at that price, consumers want to buy the quantity that producers want to sell. Nobody is forcing them to do anything. They get to do what they want. Consumers get to buy as much as they want at the price, and producers get to sell as much as they want to sell at that price. Very, very important idea. So we got demand, we've got supply, we've got equilibrium. Very important to understand demand shift factors. These are the things that will shift the demand curve. They're also the things that they're the things that affect the consumer other than the price of the product itself. Basically, anything that affects the consumer other than the price of that good will shift the demand curve. And here we've listed the things that are generally important. Income, obviously that affects consumers. Population determines how many consumers there are. Because when we're talking about demand, we're talking about all of the consumers in a particular market. So if you get more population, you get more consumers. Price of substitutes, price of complements. We said substitutes are things that do provide the same service or the same good. Pepsi and Coke are substitutes for each other. Complements being two things that people tend to use together. Coffee and sugar, or tea and sugar, something like that. Whereas coffee and tea would be what? What's the relationship there?
Substitutes.
Okay, they would be substitutes. You don't generally go to a restaurant and order coffee and tea. You might get one or the other. Expectations. Here we're talking, since we are talking about demand, we're talking about the expectations of consumers, because the demand curve is showing you how consumers are going to behave. That is the fundamental point. Demand tells you nothing about the producers. It tells you only about the consumers, only what they will do given certain circumstances. And so if the consumers, think about a hurricane. If consumers think a hurricane is coming and they think that's going to cause the price of gas to go up, then consumers are going to change their behavior. If you have a car that doesn't have gas in it and you think the price is going to go from $1.50 to $3, you have an incentive to change your behavior. You want to buy more gas now, which means because you're starting to expect a higher price for any given price, let's say $1.50, you want a larger quantity now than before. So if consumers start to expect the price is going to go up, then the demand for the product will increase. If they think the price is going to go down, the demand for the product will decrease. Okay? If consumers' expectations haven't changed, then demand isn't going to change. All right, and then taste, basically everything else that affects the consumer. We haven't listed everything. There are other things that, sometimes you have a fad. People they want a certain product. Well, if something else changes, then that will shift the demand curve. And which way it shifts depends on what the change is. I think we talked about ice cream and temperature last time, that if we're talking about the demand for ice cream and the temperature goes up by 30 degrees, then that's going to affect how much ice cream people want. The demand's going to go up. If the demand, or if the temperature goes down, I think I saw the other day in Colorado, it went from 101 to freezing in just a day or so. Okay. Think about what that would do to the demand for ice cream. As it gets lower, the demand is going to get lower. We don't list temperature there because for a lot of goods, temperature isn't important. But for any particular good, if you think about it, you'd be able to identify some things that would have an impact. Or supply. These are things that would shift the supply curve. You want to be sure you understand these. Notice these are things that have a direct impact on what the producers are going to do. What the producers are willing to do, how much they're willing to sell. Technological innovations and changes in the price of inputs. If you're producing pocket calculators and a new technology comes along that lowers the cost to you of producing calculators, well, then you're going to be willing to produce more because lower production costs mean it's more profitable to produce. So the innovation would cause the supply to shift to the right. And just like with demand, if it's shifting to the right, that's an increase. If it's shifting to the left, that is a decrease. Taxes and subsidies have a similar effect. Basically, anything that makes production more profitable will motivate the producers to produce more. And anything that makes it less profitable motivates them to produce less. If you impose a tax on the production of something, well, that's adding a cost to the producer. And so they're going to produce less. If you impose a subsidy, what is a subsidy?
It's a state benefit to do something.
Yeah, it's where the government is giving a benefit to the producer if they produce product. So if the government is subsidizing something, such as ethanol, then that's an encouragement. It makes it more profitable to the producers to produce the product. So if you increase the subsidy, it's going to increase supply. If you increase the tax, it's going to decrease supply. I skipped over price of inputs. Obviously, one of the things that will have an impact on how profitable production of something is would be, what do you have to pay to get the inputs? If you're talking about the production of housing, well, you have to have lumber. If the price of lumber goes up, the cost of producing housing goes up. It becomes less profitable to build houses, and so supply would decrease. Think about oil and gasoline. If this is the supply of gas today and the price of oil goes up, what's going to happen to the supply of gas?
It's going to move leftward. It's going to go down.
It's going to move to the left because to produce gas, one of the inputs is oil. If the cost of the input is higher, then the cost of producing gas is higher. That means it's less profitable to produce gas. And so supply is going to decrease. For any given price, the quantity producers will supply is now going to be smaller than before. Okay? Expectations, here we're talking about expectations of producers. If the producers start to think that it's going to become, the price is going to go up, they're going to behave in a certain way. If they think it's going to go down, they're going to behave in a different way. Yeah.
That's the insulin problems. I think from macroeconomics, it was orange producers in Florida, it gets unseasonably cold. And the producers are expecting it to be cold. So that's going to be, it's going to affect the supply of the oranges.
Well, let me restate for the Zoom people. If we're talking about the market for oranges in Florida, and if suddenly there's an expectation that there's going to be bad weather and that a lot of the orange crop is going to be destroyed. Well, think about what's going to happen. If a lot of the orange crop is destroyed, then the supply of oranges in the future is going to go down. The price of oranges is going to go up. Okay? If the consumers are expecting this, what are the consumers going to do?
Just the consumer behavior.
They're going to adjust their behavior. If you think it's going to become more expensive in the future, then you want to go ahead and buy now. So the demand would go up now. On the supply side, if the producers think that the price is going to go up in the future, then they think maybe they're selling for I don't know, $1 an orange now. Well, if they think the price is going to go up to $2 per orange, they say, I'm going to not sell as much now. I'm going to sell more later when the price is higher. So if the producers if everybody's expecting the price is going to go up, then the demand would go up now, supply would go down now. And both of those would tend to cause the price to go up, to go ahead and go up right away. Entry or exit of producers, that's very similar to population. You got more producers, are you going to get more output or less output? You're going to get more. So just as an increase in population increases demand, an increase in the number of producers, which we call entry, increases supply. If we have exit where producers are leaving, then supply is going to decrease. And then a change in opportunity cost. This one's a little, maybe a little vague. If the opportunity cost of using the resources that are used to produce this product change, that's going to affect supply. Let's say that you have, say this is the supply of, we'll say wheat. Okay? This is the supply of wheat. And let's say that the land that's used to grow wheat could also be used to grow soybeans. I don't know if that's true or not, but let's just assume it, if it could be used for either one. And let's say you're growing wheat right now. If the price of soybeans goes way up, what are you going to think about doing? You think, well, I'm going to plant less wheat, I'm going to plant more soybeans. So if the price of an alternative use of your resource goes up, then the opportunity cost of producing this product, the wheat in this case, goes up, and the supply would decrease. Okay? All right. Important to understand this: equilibrium and the gains from trade. A free market maximizes the gains from trade. I'll demonstrate that with a graph in just a second. The reasons for, or what that really means: available goods are bought by buyers with the highest willingness to pay. You have a free market, who's going to buy what's available? The people who value it the most or the least. If you value it the least, you're not willing to pay the price. So whatever's available goes to the consumers who are willing to pay the most for it. Goods are sold by the sellers with the lowest cost. Sellers with a high cost of production, they're not going to produce. If their opportunity cost is higher than the equilibrium price, they're not going to produce at all. They're only going to produce if the price is really high. So you get Whatever is available is purchased by the consumers who value it the most. The goods are produced by the producers who have the lowest cost. And the third part, there are no unexploited gains from trade or any wasteful trades. Now, I'll demonstrate what that is here. Here we have, it's supposed to be the market for oil, and demand, the supply. Obviously, this is the equilibrium. Okay? Remember, we talked about consumer surplus and producer surplus. Okay? Think back, what is consumer surplus? How did we define that?
It's the gains that are on the other side of the demand curve. I don't know.
This is two different ways we could say it. It is the gains going to consumers. Likewise, producer surplus is the gain going to producers. But we also said consumer surplus is the difference between the most consumers would have been willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. So here, the price is going to be $70. Okay. And how do we know how much a consumer is willing to pay for something? We look at the demand curve. Okay. For the very first unit, there's somebody willing to pay way up here, over $100. Okay. They only have to pay 70. So they're getting a huge gain, huge consumer surplus on that first unit. And as we look at more and more units, what are those extra units worth? Well, we always read that off of the demand curve. For each unit, the demand curve tells us the most somebody was willing to pay for that unit. And so the consumer surplus for each unit is the difference between the most the consumer is willing to pay and what they actually had to pay. So you've got consumer surplus of that amount on the first unit, and then a slightly smaller on the next. The total consumer surplus is the sum of all those differences between what the consumer was willing to pay and what they actually had to pay. And so as you continue going all the way out to the equilibrium, the consumer surplus is all of that triangular area. Okay? And actually it doesn't tell us what the top number is here, so we'd have to estimate it. Okay? We'll do one of those a little bit later. Right now, what I want you to see is where the consumer surplus is on the graph, what it represents. It's the gain that consumers are getting from consuming the product at the market price. Okay? And the total consumer surplus would be all of this triangular area there. Okay? Producer surplus is very similar. It's the gain going to the producers from being able to sell the product at the equilibrium price of 70. And it's the difference between what the producers actually receive and the minimum they would have been willing to accept. So for the first unit somewhere in here, read up to the supply curve. That shows us there was a producer who was willing to produce that first unit at a very low price, maybe around $20, it looks like. Okay. So some producer got a $50 producer surplus on that first unit because he sold it for 70 and he would have been willing to accept 20. Next unit, well, his cost is a little bit higher. He requires a higher price, as you can see on the supply curve, but he gets the same equilibrium price. So on that second unit, there is a producer surplus, not quite as large as for the first one. Okay? But it's still very significant. As we move to more and more units, the minimum price producers are willing to accept is getting higher and higher, okay? As you see the supply curve going up. Once we get to the equilibrium, that point on the supply curve is telling you, in order to motivate a producer to produce that 70th unit, what is the price they have to receive? $70. And the price they actually receive is $70. So on that very last unit, there's no producer surplus. Just like on the last unit, there's no consumer surplus. But on every unit prior to that, the producers are getting some surplus and the consumers are getting some surplus. The producer surplus would be this big triangle. Consumer surplus would be this big triangle. When it talks about the gains from trade, that just means the total of the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. Okay? Gains from trade are the total that anybody is getting. Now, question here. Yeah.
What was the definition you gave for producer surplus?
The definition for producer surplus, we said two things. One would be the gains that the producers are getting, but to calculate it, it would be the difference between what they're actually receiving and the minimum they would have been willing to accept. The minimum they would have been willing to accept. For example, on the 50th unit there, you read up to the supply curve, you read over, there's a producer who would have been willing to produce that 50th unit for $50. Okay? But he didn't get $50, he got 70. So there's a producer who's getting $20 of consumer surplus on that particular unit. And the total producer surplus is just the total of the producer surplus that's being received on all 70 units. Okay? Now now that I've messed up the graph here, the red area, this area there, okay? The shaded in area, not my area. What does that represent?
Is that the marginal? No.
Okay, we've said the equilibrium quantity is 70, equilibrium price is 70. We've identified the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. But here in this graph, they're asking a question really. What if we stopped at 50? What if we didn't produce the last 20 units? Okay. If we stopped at 50, it would not be equilibrium, and it would not maximize the gains from trade. That's the point of this graph. If we stopped at 50, for what there's no reason we would, okay? We won't in a free market, but if we did, and we only produce 50, then what would the very next unit be worth to a consumer? Well, you'd find that by reading up to the demand curve. And there's a consumer who would be willing to pay about $90 for the 51st unit. And reading up to the supply curve, there's a consumer who would have been willing, it'd be a producer who would have been willing to provide that 51st unit if he'd gotten a price of about $50. So you've got a consumer who's saying, I'm willing to pay up to 90. You got a producer who's saying, I'll accept anything over 50. There's a $40 gain from trade on that very next unit. Okay? If that unit doesn't get produced, then we lose that gain from trade. Nobody gets to enjoy it. That's why it's called unexploited gains from trade. For those units 51 through 70, there's a potential gain, there's a potential benefit that can be shared by the consumers and the producers. If something prevents those last 20 units from being produced, then that potential gain is lost. It's unexploited. We don't get it. And consumers and producers are going to be worse off in this market. One of the reasons you may think, well, who cares? Why is that important? We're going to see that there are a number of policies that the government enacts which will have the effect of moving us from 70 back to 50. And that means the gains from trade, this huge area, is going to be reduced. Because if we only produce 50, then the if we only produce 50, then this area represents gains from trade that we could have enjoyed. Benefits consumers and producers both would have shared. We lose that. Okay? You could call that inefficiency. Okay? It's gains that were not exploited. And one of the purposes of a course like this is to help us understand the gains from trade so we can figure out what kind of policies can the government follow which will enable us to maximize those gains from trade. If we're in equilibrium, then the gains from trade will be at a maximum, which means consumers and producer welfare will be at a maximum. If something prevents us from getting to that equilibrium quantity, then a part of those gains that we could have had, we don't get. Okay, so one problem we would like to avoid is having unexploited gains, where the units that we really do want them produced, they don't get produced. We want to try to avoid that. The other problem is what you see here. What if, this is the same supply curve and the demand curve, equilibrium is still at 70 units and $70. What if, for some reason, we end up consuming out here at 90? We've got more of this product than we would have had in equilibrium. Is that a good thing? We generally think more is preferred to less. So should we say, well, yeah, that'd be great?
I'd say no, because if the consumers aren't willing to demand that quantity, then whoever just made them, they're shit out of luck with the stuff they use to make the stuff.
That's the general idea. If in thinking about where do we want to be, we need to think about, as always in economics, what are the benefits? What are the costs? What are the benefits of getting these extra 20 units? Now, what are the costs of getting the extra 20 units? If we're in equilibrium here, okay, reading off the demand curve, that last unit is just worth $70 to a consumer. And reading off the supply curve, that last unit costs the producer $70. So if we're at the equilibrium, we have produced all the way out. We produced all of these initial units where the value to the consumer was greater than the cost. And we got a gain on all those. We got all the way out here to equilibrium, where the last unit was just barely worth what it cost. We're in equilibrium, that's where we stop. Okay? From an efficiency standpoint, that's what we want to do. But if somehow the government has done something that causes us to go out to 90, okay, that's inefficient. Because what is the 90th unit worth to a consumer given this demand, given the demand curve there? The 90th unit is only worth $50 to a consumer. What, based on the supply curve, what does it cost to produce that 90th unit? It costs $90. So would we like to have a unit that has a value of $50 to a consumer? Well, yeah, we like to have that. But if we're going to use the resources efficiently, we have to compare benefits with cost. And so we ask, does it make sense to use up $90 worth of resources to produce something that's worth only $50 to consumer? The answer is no. There's here that gap isn't a gain from trade, that's a loss from trade. That's an inefficiency due to something being produced that is not worth what it is costing. And that would apply to all of these last 20 units. The cost of producing them exceeds the value or the benefit to consumers. So this green area represents a waste of resources. We're producing units that are valuable to consumers. The value would be represented by the area under the demand curve. Problem is that the cost of producing those units is greater than the benefits of using those units. And the green area would be the measure of the inefficiency that is created. So what do we see with these two graphs? With this one, we're seeing if we produce more than the equilibrium outcome, then we have a waste of resources. If we produce less than the equilibrium outcome, then we have unexploited gains from trade. We don't want to be in either of those situations. If we produce at the equilibrium, that's exactly where we want to be, because the gains from trade will be at a maximum. Okay? And remember, in a free market, we get to that equilibrium outcome where the gains are maximized, even though there's nobody figuring out what people should be doing. Everybody's doing what's best for them, but the end result is that the gains from trade are maximized. Look at this, you come away thinking, wow, markets really do a great job of allocating resources. But I have to give you the footnote that this is not the whole story. Once we get over to chapter 10, we will see there are markets where there are something called externalities, where it's not just the consumer and the producer who are affected, there are other parties who are affected. And when you have externalities, then the nice, efficient outcome we have here will not be obtained, and there are some problems. So markets don't solve all of our problems, okay? And we'll get to that over in chapter 10. Questions here? All right. All right, let's go through a few examples. Just to make sure you know how to use the analysis and use the terminology correctly. If you are told that as you know, we've gone into a recession, okay? People's incomes have gone down. You're told we're in a recession. You're asked, what effect is this likely to have on the market for cars? Okay. Well, first, the fact that we're in a recession, is that likely to affect directly consumers or producers?
Consumers.
Going to be consumers. So you got to think through in terms of the process. Think in terms of the shift factors. One of the shift factors for demand was income. Okay? The producers, they don't know how much you make. They don't care how much you make. Okay? The producers will be indirectly affected by recession. Okay? But they're affected only because consumers change their behavior. The initial effect of being in recession and lower income is on the consumer. So that if we're talking about the demand for, let's say, new cars, we go into recession, what do people do when they lose their job or their income is lower? How does that affect their demand for new cars?
Prioritize different things in their budget.
They have to prioritize. They can't have everything. And so, especially for something that is expensive, like a new car, they are likely to cut back on their purchases of new cars. And so when we go into recession, then the demand for something like new cars will go down. And what happens? Well, where are we going to end up? We're going to decrease in demand. Where are we going to end up here?
With a new equilibrium.
That's what you think in terms of. You start with equilibrium, you look at the change that occurred, you shift the curve, and then you look for where is the new equilibrium. Okay? And so, and then equilibrium is always at the intersection of the two curves. So we're going to go from the original to the new. What happens? Price of the product goes down, and the quantity demanded of the product goes down. Okay? Now, I specified this is demand for new cars. Why did I make that specification?
With used cars, they're already made and they're already ready to go.
Okay, true, but how does that matter? Which is cheaper? A used car is cheaper. Okay? So it's a very good chance that some of the people who decide I can't afford a new car decide, well, I'll buy a used car. I'd rather have the new car, but they may choose to buy the used car. And so it's possible, can't say for sure, but it is possible that the demand for used cars can actually go up. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, but it potentially could go up. And this brings in or focuses our attention on the distinction between normal goods and inferior goods. What's the difference?
The inferior good has been used at some point.
No.
Normal would be what you would typically buy, and inferior is what you buy because of those circumstances.
Not necessarily. For normal and inferior, those are two terms. You want to be sure you know the exact meaning of them. And normal is very straightforward. Just means if something is a normal good, that means that when people's incomes go up, their demand for that good goes up. Okay? Their income goes down, their demand for that good goes down. Inferior is the opposite. That is defined as a good that as your income goes up, your demand for that good goes down. Steak, for most people, would be a normal good. Your income goes up, your demand for steak probably goes up. You lose your job, your demand for steak probably goes down. What would not fit that in the same category? What's something that as your income goes up, you'd actually consume less?
Something like ramen noodles.
Ramen noodles is it used to be Spam, but now people always think of ramen noodles that people buy because it's cheap, not because it's the best thing in the world. So for ramen noodles and everything else that is an inferior good, it's relatively low quality. And so when their income goes up, they don't buy more of the low quality product. They choose to switch to a higher quality product. As their income goes up, their demand for ramen noodles goes down, their demand for steak goes up. So they're switching from the low quality into the higher quality good. Whereas when we go into recession, incomes are going down, the demand for steak goes down, the demand for ramen noodles goes up. Okay? Notice in working through this, we're thinking about who's going to change their behavior first, who is directly affected by the change, which means which curve is going to shift. Notice here, when we're talking about new cars, we said demand would decrease. We're going to move from here down to there. Quantity demanded is now going to be lower. What's happened to quantity supply?
Quantity supply has also gone down.
It's also going down. Let's say it's 50 million cars before, and it goes down to 40 million. We were in equilibrium at 50 million. So quantity demanded and quantity supplied were both 50. After this change, quantity demand is now 40, quantity supplied is now 40. Okay? So producers did change their behavior. Okay? Producers were affected. Okay? So is there a change in supply here? No. Well, why did producers cut back on the quantities they supplied? There was a change in quantity demanded. True, absolutely true. But what else changed? If we ask the producers, why are you supplying a smaller quantity? They would say, because the price went down. Okay? The direct effect was on the consumers. That shifted the demand curve. But because the demand curve shifted, that lowered the price. And the producers do respond to the lower price. Okay? So this event, this change in income, affects both consumers and producers. But it has a direct effect on consumers, and that is shown in the decrease in demand. And it then has an indirect effect on producers because it pushes the price down, and the producers then respond to that. Okay? Now, in our current situation, the car market has been very interesting because we did go into recession, incomes went down, so demand has decreased. Okay? But in our current situation, we don't just have a recession. We had a period of a number of months where the auto companies were not allowed to produce anything. Okay? So that means supply also decreased. Demand decreased and supply decreased. So if you have both things changing, how do you figure out what's going to happen to the price? It's very simple. You do it one thing at a time. You look at the demand decrease, you figure out what was the effect. You look at the supply decrease, you figure out what was the effect. Here, looking first at demand, that moved our equilibrium from here down to here. clearly the effect on price was to cause the price to go down. Okay? Now, we're at this point, if we ask, well, what's the supply side effect? Okay? Well, that was the shift of supply up and to the left. So that would move our equilibrium from here to here. Clearly, that is tending to push the price up. When we have two changes, we have to look at each change separately. And we see that price is being pushed down by the demand decrease, price is being pushed up by the supply decrease. We've got opposite effects going on. So ultimately, what's going to happen to the price? Okay? It's ambiguous. Unless we know exactly what these effects are and how big they are, then we don't know what the effect is going to be. If the demand decrease was very small and the supply decrease was very large, then the price could go up. But if the magnitudes were different, then the price could go down. You just don't know for sure what will happen to the price unless you know the specific magnitude of each change. Now, if I tell you the graph I've drawn here, this is exactly what happened. This is not just the direction of change, but this is exactly what happened. Then you could look at this and say, well, we started out here, demand decreased, supply decreased. The new equilibrium is here. So you could say, looks like the price decreased a little bit. Okay? And that is an outcome that can occur. But if the curves had been drawn differently, then the price might have gone up or it could have stayed the same. You just don't know for sure. Okay? All right. Consider another example. What if we're looking at the demand for tea and the supply of tea, and the price of sugar goes up?
That's quantity demanded of tea. Is the price of a complement change?
Think in terms of which curve is going to shift. Who's directly affected by the change? I'm sorry?
The producing.
What's the relationship between tea and sugar?
It's a complement.
They're complements, okay? Because people tend to use them together. Okay? If they're complements, then it is the consumer who's going to be directly affected. Okay? Maybe the price of tea was $3 a pound before, and now it's $30 a pound. Okay? For tea drinkers, that's quite a shock. Okay? The producers, they don't care except to the extent that consumers are going to change their behavior. Okay? So if sugar is now really expensive, we can expect that, or that means that the cost of drinking a cup of tea with sugar in it has gone way up. And so fewer people will want to buy tea because it's now more expensive to drink their cup of tea given the higher price for sugar. Yeah.
So that's a complete shift of the demand curve.
Right. Remember the price of a complement. That is one of the things held constant for the demand curve. It's one of the things that is a shift factor for demand. And so that's why you want to go back and review the list of shift factors for demand and for supply on a regular basis, because you want to be able to look at a problem and it pop into your head. Which is this? Because as soon as you see, these are complements, then you know it's demand that's going to shift. And then you just have to figure out, well, are people going to demand more tea, given that it's now going to cost them more to drink it with sugar? Or are they going to demand less? clearly they're going to demand less. Once you draw the new demand curve in, it's clear where the equilibrium is. Okay? So the graph leads you to the right answer. You draw the new curve in, you then look for the new intersection. And you can see that's at a lower price and a lower quantity. So the effects are that the quantity demanded of T is going to go down. The price of T is going to go down. Okay? Demand has decreased. Has supply decreased? Supply of T? No, because how many supply curves are there? Just one. Okay? True, the producers are cutting back on the quantity they supply. Why are they doing that? Because the price is now lower. Okay? It's a change in demand, not a change in supply. Okay? And if you go through the steps of draw the curve, identify the equilibrium, think about which curve is going to shift, okay? Draw in that shift, identify the new equilibrium. If you do that and you go through it enough, then you will not have any trouble with these kinds of questions. Problem people have is they once they start to see it, then they assume they've got it and they stop working on it. So you want to overlearn this. You want to keep going until you get bored with it. It's just so easy. Okay? And I have seen people who, once they realize, oh, I'm supposed to graduate this semester, I'm not going to graduate. Then their mind becomes very focused and they start overlearning the material, and they, instead of making D's, they make A's. That happens. So you want to start doing that now. All right. One more example. Let's do, let's go back to gas. Price of gas is $2 per gallon. If everybody thinks there's a hurricane coming, everybody thinks it's going to go right through the oil fields in the Gulf, and it's going to push the price of gas up. Everybody thinks the price of gas soon is going to be $5 per gallon. Okay? But nothing has happened yet. What's going to happen in the market right now?
It's going to be a shift in the demand, shift in the quantity, shift in the quantity demanded. They're going to want more at the current price.
We would only say that a shift of the curve. Okay? Quantity demanded is just a point. Okay? So it is going to be a shift of the demand curve because consumer expectations have changed. Is demand going to increase or decrease? I'm sorry? It's going to increase. Okay? People, and this confuses people. They say, but gas is $5 a gallon and they're going to want more. No, the price hasn't changed. It's their expectation has changed. They're thinking I can buy it for $2 today, or I can wait until the future and buy it for $5. So their demand for $2 gas increases. So the demand shifts to the right, which means at that original price, consumers want a much larger quantity than before. Let's say quantity was 100,000 gallons. Now they want 200,000 gallons. Okay? But the producers also know that there's a storm out there. And the producers also think the price is going to go to $5. So this change in producer expectations, what does that do?
They're going to adjust the supply that they make.
The supply is going to adjust because expectations is a shift factor for both demand and supply. So supply is also going to shift. And if the producers think that in the near future they can get $5 per gallon, what are they going to do? Do they want to sell it today at $2 or in the future for $5? $5 sounds pretty good. So they have an incentive to cut back on the amount that they supply. The increase in demand moves us from this equilibrium to that equilibrium. That pushed the price up. The decrease in supply moves us from this equilibrium to that equilibrium. So both of these changes are having the effect of pushing the price up. So even though the hurricane hasn't hit yet and no damage has occurred, the price may go up to $5 right away because everybody's anticipating what is going to happen. Okay? And every time something like this happens, people become outraged that nothing has happened, and yet these producers are price gouging. They're trying to profit from the situation. But what the way economics suggests we should look at this is the value of gas has changed. It is more valuable now than before. And the higher price reflects the fact that it is now more valuable. If you keep the price down at $2, then consumers want to buy a whole lot more than is available. If you let the price go up, people economize. They have an incentive to economize. Plus, if you keep the price down, producers are not willing to produce as much. So by keeping the price down, you're ensuring that there won't be much available now, and consumers will want a lot of it. So you get what?
Shortage.
You get a shortage. Okay? And before, we said in a free market, when you have a shortage, the price goes up and fixes the problem. But if the government prevents the price from going up, okay, then you get a shortage that cannot be eliminated. And so you have people desperately wanting gasoline, but they can't get any because the price has been held down. And the price may stay down because it's illegal to raise the price. I mean, you can go to jail for raising the price under disaster conditions, or it can simply be that the producers are afraid that their customers will be unhappy with them, and so they keep the price down. What I want you to see is if we let the price go up, then it may go ahead and go up to $5. Okay? But at that new higher price, we can have an equilibrium. People are able to buy the gas that they want. They have to pay more for it, okay? But they're able to get what they want. We will talk, once we get over to chapter 8, I think it is, we will talk a lot about the effects of price controls. They have a lot of effects, not just shortages, but a lot of other pernicious effects. All right, we have said that when the price of a product goes up, quantity demanded goes down. That's law of demand. How much does it go down? If the price goes up by 1%, do people cut back by 50%? Well, we haven't said. We haven't said anything about how sensitive consumers are to a change in the price, or how sensitive producers are to a change in the price. But that sensitivity is very, very important. And in chapter 5, we will start looking at the idea of the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. Think about the idea of elastic. What would be something that is elastic? A rubber band. Okay? You pull, you apply a force to a rubber band and it changes. Demand is elastic if consumers change their behavior a lot when the price changes. What would be something that's not elastic? Metal or a brick. You apply force to a brick, it doesn't change. Okay? We're going to call that inelastic. We're going to see there's some products where when the price changes even a lot, doesn't have much effect on the amount that consumers want. Other products where if it changes a little bit, they change their demand, the quantity demanded a lot. Okay? Elasticity is a very important idea. And that's what we will be developing in chapter 5. You want to be sure to read that before we get to it, because it does become rather technical. Just give you the equation to look for. Elasticity is measured with this equation. The percent change in the quantity demanded over the percent change in price. That's the equation we're going to be using to do elasticity calculations. You will need to know how to do the calculation, but more importantly, you'll need to be able to interpret what the result means. And elasticity is a very useful concept. So be sure to read that before next time, and that's what we will spend all of next time on. Any questions? All right, we'll see you next time.